She spat on the human, then cried when he took the arrow for her. The air in the security nexus of the Jalian Imperial Palace was a sterile, silent testament to a culture that had elevated logic to a state of godhood. Every surface was polished obsidian, every holographic display a cool, serene blue. Data flowed in placid streams, parsed by algorithms of perfect, emotionless clarity. It was a reflection of its commander, Vera, of the Praetorian Guard. She stood before the central command table, a statuesque figure in black and silver armor, her posture an unyielding line of discipline. Her luminous violet eyes scanned the threat assessments, her sharp, elegant features betraying nothing. The negotiations for an alliance with the Terrans were a logical necessity, a distasteful but required step for mutual survival against the encroaching scourge. The humans themselves, however, were an exercise in managing chaos. Especially this one. Wyatt stood on the opposite side of the holotable, a solid, immovable presence that seemed to absorb the room's pristine light. He was broad-shouldered, packed with the dense, functional muscle of a life lived by brutal physical truths. He wasn't looking at the data streams. His gaze was distant, sweeping over the live feeds of the palace grounds, but his focus was clearly internal. He was, as he'd infuriatingly put it, getting a feel for the place. Vera's lip curled. It was the sloppiness of it, the reliance on some unquantifiable, primitive impulse, that she found so offensive. My analysis of the separatist faction's rhetoric and known tactics indicates a 94% probability of a disruptive but non-lethal protest action in the Plaza of Accord, she stated, her voice crisp and devoid of inflection. They'll try to kill her, Wyatt said, his voice a low baritone that was jarringly calm. He didn't look at her, his eyes still on the feeds. Vera's pointed ears tightened. Your assertion is not supported by the data, she clipped. Their primary goal is to discredit the alliance, to make the Empress appear weak for dealing with outsiders. A successful assassination would martyr her and unify the populace against them. It is illogical. They're desperate, Wyatt countered, finally turning his steady gaze on her. Desperate people don't care about logic. They care about sending a message, and the loudest message is a body. He tapped a control, zooming in on a sanitation crew near the plaza's fountain. These workers, their biometrics are stable. Too stable. They're suppressing their anxiety. They're not just nervous about their jobs, they're trying to hide something. Vera's disdain finally fractured her control. This was the core of her problem with his species. They saw ghosts in the machine, phantoms in the data, all born from their own turbulent, unreliable emotions. It was a contamination. Her security force, the finest in the galaxy, operated on pure, verifiable fact. This human's presence was an insult to her Empress, and to the very foundation of her culture. She stepped around the table until she stood directly before him. He was taller than she anticipated, a wall of dense physicality. She looked up into his unreadable eyes, her own flashing with violet fire. Your feelings are not a valid security metric, she said, her voice dropping to a low, dangerous hiss. They are a flaw, a vulnerability to be exploited. To punctuate her contempt, to make her position absolutely, irrefutably clear, she turned her head and spat on the polished floor at his feet. The gesture was sharp, precise, and loaded with a millennium of Zale superiority. Keep your impurities to yourself, Terran. The grand ceremony was a symphony of Jalian precision. Thousands of citizens stood in silent, ordered rows within the Plaza of Accord, a vast expanse of white marble and sculpted gardens. Floating platforms drifted silently, bearing dignitaries, their jeweled robes catching the light of the system's binary suns. Vera stood at the base of the Empress's dais, a living statue in her silver-chased armor, her senses and her network of guards perfectly synced. Every threat vector was calculated, every probability mapped. The Separatists, if they acted, would attempt a disruption from the West Corridor, the most logical point of ingress. Her guards were layered 10 deep there. Everything was under control. Wyatt stood a few paces to her left, a stark and brooding shape in his simple dark Terran formal wear. He was, to her irritation, ignoring the logical threat vectors completely. His gaze was fixed on a distant spire, a needle of polished rock that pierced the sky hundreds of floors above the plaza. A maintenance cradle, carrying a pair of window cleaners, was inching its way down the spire's face. a detail so mundane, so utterly irrelevant, that her own threat analysis software had tagged it as zero risk and moved on. Yet Wyatt's entire body was coiled like a spring, his focus absolute. The Empress, her ancient voice amplified across the plaza, spoke of a new era of cooperation, of two different peoples finding common cause. Her words were a balm of pure logic, soothing the anxieties of her populace. Vera allowed herself a moment of pride in the perfection of the event, in the flawless execution of her security plan. It was in that moment of self-congratulation that Wyatt moved. He didn't shout. There wasn't time. He simply launched himself towards her, his motion a blur of explosive power that defied the formal cut of his clothes. His one word was a guttural command. Down. His shoulder hit her with the force of a freight hauler, driving her from her feet. The world became a confusing whirl of white marble and blue sky. She was falling, his heavy body covering hers, shielding her. Then came the sound, a horrifying high-frequency crack that tore through the serene air. It was not the sound of an explosion or a protester's cry. It was the sound of something small and impossibly fast breaking the sound barrier right where her head had been a second before. She twisted her head just in time to see the impact. The flechette, a sliver of dark metal, struck Wyatt high on the chest, on his right pectoral. It should have punched straight through him, but his formal jacket was lined with Terran-made ballistic weave, a crude but effective defense. The projectile didn't penetrate. The kinetic energy, however, had to go somewhere. The impact was catastrophic. A spiderweb of violent purple bruising instantly erupted across his chest, and a strangled, broken sound was torn from his throat. The force of the blow lifted him from her, and he landed heavily on the marble beside her, his body convulsing. Chaos erupted. Her Praetorian guards, their perfect logic shattered by an attack from a direction they had deemed impossible, swarmed the dais. The plaza dissolved into a panicked, screaming mob. But Vera saw none of it. Her universe had collapsed to the space between herself and the fallen human. His eyes were wide, unfocused, his breath coming in ragged, blood-flecked gasps. His gut feeling had been right. The maintenance cradle, the window cleaner, a sniper. Her logic had failed. Her perfect system was flawed. He had saved her. The man she had spat on, the beast she had reviled, had shielded her with his own body. A bizarre alien pressure built behind her eyes, a hot, wet sensation she had only read about in ancient prescribed texts. A sob, illogical and raw, tore from her throat as she cradled his head, her tears staining the pristine white marble. The Jael Imperial Medical Center was less a hospital and more a temple to biological science. Light was soft, air was filtered to the atomic level, and the only sounds were the gentle, rhythmic hums of autodocs and life support fields. Wyatt lay within a transparent stasis cocoon, his body held in a state of suspended animation while nanites worked to repair the catastrophic damage to his chest cavity. The flechette hadn't penetrated, but the kinetic force had shattered his clavicle, 3 ribs, and pulped the underlying muscle tissue into a hemorrhagic ruin. His heart, the Jael physicians noted with a mixture of horror and fascination, was still beating with a savage, stubborn rhythm. Vera stood her vigil outside the cocoon, a silent, armored sentinel. In the hours since the attack, she had been the image of command. She had locked down the palace, initiated the investigation, and coordinated with the terrified human delegation, her voice never wavering from its crisp, authoritative tone. But here, in the silent glow of the medical displays, the facade crumbled. Guilt was a cold, heavy stone in her gut. It was an illogical, useless emotion. Yet it was unshakable. Her pride, her certainty, her belief in the infallibility of her methods, he had shattered it all with a single selfless act. She watched the readouts scrolling beside his cocoon. Human physiology was a chaotic mess. His body temperature fluctuated wildly. His brainwave patterns were a storm of jagged peaks and troughs, a stark contrast to the placid sine waves of a resting Zael. The head physician, a wizened Zael with curious eyes, had explained it to her. His system fights. It does not surrender to the trauma. It rages against it, the physician had said, tapping a display. Our methods are designed to soothe, to bring a system back into logical harmony. His body rejects harmony. It seems to thrive on the very chaos of its own survival instinct. It is remarkably inefficient, and yet he lives. Inefficient. chaotic, impure. The words were the same ones she had used, but now they felt hollow, meaningless. She had dismissed his intuition as a flaw, but that flaw was the only reason she was still alive. She had seen him as a primitive creature, all brawn and no intellect, but his sacrifice was an act of a kind of honor she had never witnessed. It was not logical. It served no purpose for his own survival. He had thrown himself in front of an attack meant for someone who had shown him nothing but contempt. The doors to the private observation room slid open, and her second-in-command entered, his posture as rigid as her own. "Commander," he said, his voice a low monotone, "the assassin has been interrogated. He has confessed. A lone fanatic from the Orith separatist cell. All evidence corroborates his statement." Vera didn't turn. Her violet eyes remained fixed on Wyatt's still form. "All evidence?" she asked, a dangerous quiet in her voice. "His transport, his weapon, his communications, it all aligns with their known resources. It is a closed loop, Commander, a logical conclusion." "There is nothing logical about a sniper choosing an elevated, exposed position with no viable escape route," Vera countered, her mind replaying the scene. "There is nothing logical about targeting me, a military commander, when the Empress, the true symbol, was a softer target. And there is nothing logical about the fact that I am alive, and he," her voice caught for a fraction of a second, an infinitesimal crack in her composure, "is not." She finally turned to face her subordinate. "Bring me every fragment of that flechette. I want a full materials and systems analysis. I will verify the logic myself." The preliminary investigation report lay on the crystalline table in Vera's office, its conclusions stark, simple, and logical. The assassin was a known separatist. The weapon was a crude, high-velocity projectile rifle, consistent with their limited technological resources. The motive was to destabilize the alliance talks by demonstrating the incompetence of Imperial security. Every data point connected. Every loose end was tied. The case was, for all intents and purposes, closed. Vera stared at the report, a cold knot of dissatisfaction tightening in her stomach. It was too perfect. Logic was about finding truth in complexity, not accepting simple answers at face value. Her private comm chimed. It was the medical center. Wyatt had been brought out of stasis. His condition was stable, though he remained unconscious. Against all protocol, she dismissed her afternoon duties and went to him. He now lay on a diagnostic bed, the upper half of his body bare. The bruising on his chest was a horrific tapestry of deep purples and angry reds. A fine web of silver medical filaments was grafted to his skin, pulsing with a faint light as they knitted torn muscle and shattered bone back together. She found herself reaching out, her armored fingers tracing the edge of the damaged tissue. His skin was warm, radiating a heat that was startlingly intense compared to the cool placidity of Azael. As her fingertip brushed an undamaged patch of skin near his collarbone, his eyelids fluttered. His eyes opened, not the clear, steady gaze she remembered, but a clouded, pain-filled haze. His gaze found her, and his brow furrowed slightly. "Commander," he rasped, his voice rough and broken. "Lie still, bodyguard," she ordered, her tone softer than she intended. "The physicians say you will recover." A faint, wry smile touched his lips. "Good to know." He tried to shift, a wave of pain washing over his face. Instinctively, Vera moved to steady him. Her hands, one on his shoulder, the other on his arm, were meant to be clinical, a simple act of restraint. But the contact was electric. She could feel the raw, stubborn strength in him, the sheer life force thrumming beneath his skin. His muscles, even in their damaged state, were like solid rock. Her armored glove creaked as her grip tightened, an involuntary reaction to the overwhelming sensory input. His eyes cleared for a moment, and he looked at her, really looked at her, and she felt a strange, illogical heat rise in her cheeks. She pulled her hands away as if burned. Later that evening, the results from the materials lab came back. The report was mostly standard. The flechette's core was a dense, depleted tungsten alloy. Its casing, however, held an anomaly, a microscopic flaw. She magnified the image on her private console, her breath catching in her throat. It wasn't a flaw. It was a circuit trace, impossibly small, etched into the casing itself. A dormant one, fried by the kinetic impact. Its purpose was undetectable, but its origin was not. She ran it against the Galactic Materials database. The signature was faint, degraded, but unmistakable. It was Terran. The Separatist assassin, a technological primitive from a backwater moon, had fired a projectile laced with highly classified human military technology. The perfect logical conclusion of the investigation shattered into a million pieces. This wasn't a simple act of terror. It was a conspiracy of staggering complexity. And the traitor, the one who had supplied that technology, could very well be human. The thought was a shard of ice in her gut. She had to know if Wyatt was a part of it, if his sacrifice had been some kind of elaborate, incomprehensible deception. She needed answers only he could provide. She needed to trust the one person she had every reason to suspect. Vera strode back into the medical bay, her mind a maelstrom of conflicting data streams. She held a data slate with the fragment analysis. The air crackled with her coiled tension. Wyatt was awake, propped up slightly, his eyes clear and watchful as she approached. He tracked her movement with an unnerving stillness, a predator at rest. She stopped at his bedside, holding up the slate so he could see the magnified image of the Terran microcircuit. "The assassin's weapon," she said, her voice a flat, accusatory line. "It was guided by Terran technology the Separatists should not possess. Explain." His eyes narrowed, not with guilt but with intense focus. He studied the image, his brow furrowing. He said nothing for a long moment, the only sound the soft chime of his biomonitors. "It's a ghost key," he finally rasped. "A piece of deprecated stealth tech. It doesn't guide the projectile. It emits a false, low-level energy signature that active Terran security scanners are programmed to ignore. It makes the weapon invisible to our own systems." Vera felt her blood run cold. So it was designed to fool human security. "And kill a Zale target," Wyatt finished, his gaze locking with hers. "Whoever planned this wanted to make sure the human guards were blind, and that you," he paused, "were the one who went down." The implication was staggering. The traitor wasn't just trying to sabotage the Alliance, they were trying to frame humanity for it. If she had died, and the weapon was later found to be of Terran origin, the Zale Empire would have declared war, not signed a treaty. His sacrifice had not only saved her life, it had saved the entire Alliance from the Mastermind's trap. The weight of that realization settled on her, heavy and profound. Her contempt had been a tool, wielded by an enemy she hadn't even seen. "The official investigation is a lie," she said, more to herself than to him. "The evidence was planted to lead us to a simple conclusion." "A logical conclusion," Wyatt murmured, a faint knowing edge to his voice. He shifted, a grimace of pain flashing across his features. "In my old unit, we had a saying, if it's simple, clean, and makes perfect sense, you've walked into an ambush." He looked at the security logs she had brought along with the analysis. "You ran a standard diagnostic on the plaza's energy grid after the attack?" "Of course," she said. "All readings were nominal, save for a minor, illogical power fluctuation from the cleaner's cradle on the North Spire. A sensor ghost. We dismissed it as irrelevant." Wyatt's eyes lit with a spark of intensity. "It's not a ghost. That fluctuation, that's the sniper's weapon powering up. The ghost key masked the signature, but it couldn't hide the power draw. It's a needle in a haystack, but it's there. The traitor is smart, but they don't understand how we think, how we look for the things that feel wrong, not just the things that are logically out of place." She stared at him, at the raw intelligence burning in his eyes. He saw the piece of the puzzle she had discarded because it didn't fit the neat, logical picture. He was right. And in that moment, she knew she was no longer the commander and he the subordinate. They were partners. A wave of something hot and powerful washed through her, a dizzying mix of respect, shame, and a terrifying, thrilling attraction. The Imperial Palace became a gilded cage. Every guard was a potential enemy, every council member a possible suspect. The official investigation was a sham, a carefully constructed piece of theater leading to a predetermined false conclusion. Vera and Wyatt were alone, operating in the shadows of a conspiracy they were only just beginning to comprehend. Wyatt was moved from the main medical center to a private recovery suite in Vera's own heavily secured command wing, under the official guise of needing enhanced protection as a diplomatic asset. In reality, it turned him into her secret weapon. Their days fell into a new rhythm. By day, Vera performed her duties, a perfect mask of cold efficiency, while covertly feeding Wyatt encrypted data streams. By night, her quarters became their clandestine command center. She would project the data onto the walls, vast, complex webs of palace schematics, communication logs, and personnel files. She would apply her flawless logic, finding discrepancies, tracing connections. But it was Wyatt, propped up against a stack of pillows on her recliner, who would find the real clues. He would stare at the data for hours, not reading it in a linear fashion, but absorbing it, letting his intuition sift through the noise. "That guard," he'd say, pointing to a name in a patrol roster. His patrol route was changed an hour before the ceremony. The official reason was logistical, but it moved him away from the North Spire, not towards it. He wasn't being repositioned. He was being cleared out. It was in these moments of intense, shared focus that the space between them shrank. The professional boundary, already fractured, dissolved completely. It was replaced by an intimacy that was deeper and more potent than any she had ever known. She saw him not as a human, but as Wyatt. She saw the lines of pain around his eyes, the fierce determination in his jaw, the surprising gentleness in his hands when he would point to a detail on the display. His recovery was slow, agonizing. The jail nanites could knit bone and muscle, but they struggled with the chaotic storm of his human nervous system. He needed physical therapy to restore full mobility to his arm and shoulder. The medical droids were efficient, but their movements were too rigid, causing him more pain. One night, after watching him struggle, she dismissed the droid. "Your movements are inefficient," she stated, her voice soft. "You are fighting the machine. Do not fight. Allow the muscle to move as it was designed." She knelt beside him. "Show me." Her armored gauntlets were too clumsy. She unsealed them, the plates retracting with a soft hiss, revealing her bare, slender hands. His skin was fever-hot beneath her cool touch. She placed one hand on his shoulder, the other on his bicep, her fingers mapping the dense, coiled muscle. "The exercise requires you to raise your arm," she instructed, her voice a low murmur. "Slowly. Do not force it." He inhaled sharply as she guided his arm upward. She could feel the violent tremor in his muscles, the raw power held in check by searing pain. Her touch was meant to be clinical, but it was not. She was acutely aware of the texture of his skin, the sheer, solid mass of him. His scent, a mix of antiseptic and a warm, musky scent that was uniquely his, filled her senses. He looked at her, his eyes dark, his breathing strained. The air in the room grew thick, heavy with unspoken tension. Her hand on his bicep tightened, her thumb stroking over the hard curve of the muscle. The movement was unconscious, instinctual. His gaze dropped to her lips. The universe seemed to shrink to the space of a single breath, held between them. The trail of whispers and ghosts in the data led them to a place Vera could not logically accept. The security overrides, the falsified patrol logs, the encrypted communications routed through separatist channels, they all pointed back to a single nexus of command within the Praetorian Guard. Her nexus. And the authorizing codes belonged to one of the few beings in the Empire who could access them. Lord Vorlag, member of the Empress's High Council, decorated war hero, and the Jael who had personally selected her for the Guard. He was her mentor. The revelation felt like a physical blow. Vorlag had shaped her career, honed her skills, and taught her that logic was the only true shield against the chaos of the galaxy. That he could be the traitor was a paradox that her mind struggled to process. It was Wyatt who gave the horrifying possibility a voice. "It's always the one you don't want it to be," he said quietly, watching her face as she stared at the incriminating data trace. "The patriot who loves his country so much he's willing to burn it down to save it from changing." His words, born of human experience with millennia of civil wars and betrayals, resonated with a terrible truth. Vorlag was a traditionalist. He had spoken openly in the Council against the Alliance, arguing that humanity's emotional volatility would be a corrupting influence on the Jael way of life. She had dismissed it as the cautious conservatism of an old soldier. Now she saw it as the motive for high treason. He had orchestrated the assassination attempt on her, his own protégé, knowing that her death at the hands of a human weapon would turn the Empress and the people against the Terrans forever. He would have been hailed as a prophet, a Cassandra who had warned against the alien taint. He had used the Separatists as his pawns, and her as his sacrifice. The cold fury that filled Vera was an emotion she had never truly experienced. It was pure, clean, and utterly absolute. It was a human emotion, and it demanded a reckoning. The final treaty signing was rescheduled, set to take place in the Empress's throne room, a smaller, more secure venue. It was Vorlog's suggestion, a logical precaution he'd proposed in his capacity as a security advisor. Vera and Wyatt now saw it for what it was, the closing of a trap. With the human delegation and the Empress in one place, he could eliminate them all and seize control in the ensuing chaos. They tried to warn the Imperial Court, but Vorlog was too entrenched, his reputation too sterling. Their evidence was circumstantial, based on data anomalies and human intuition. They were dismissed. They were on their own. On the day of the signing, Wyatt stood beside her, no longer a patient, but a partner. He wore a simple dark gray tunic that did nothing to hide the formidable power of his physique. His right arm was still braced, but his eyes were clear and sharp. "Whatever happens," he said, his voice low and for her alone, "I'm with you." She simply nodded, her hand briefly, almost unconsciously, brushing his. The contact was a silent promise. As the human ambassador approached the dais to sign the treaty, the palace alarms blared to life. Red alert lights bathed the throne room in a bloody glow. "Separatist attack on the southern perimeter," a guard loyal to Vorlog shouted, his voice laced with practiced panic. It was the diversion. Lord Vorlog drew his ceremonial energy blade, its hum a sharp counterpoint to the wailing alarms. "To the Empress! Praetorians! Form a shield wall!" he commanded. But the guards who answered his call did not move to protect the Empress. They turned, weapons raised, to face Vera, Wyatt, and the terrified human delegation. Their faces were blank, their movements precise. They were Vorlog's chosen, his co-conspirators. "Vera, my dear," Vorlog said, his voice smooth and full of false pity, "you should have accepted the logical conclusion. Your association with this creature has clouded your judgment." He gestured to Wyatt. "This is what human impurity brings. Chaos, death. I will cleanse this court of it, and you with it." The first guard lunged. The throne room erupted into a maelstrom of controlled violence. Vera moved with the fluid, deadly grace of a striking serpent, her own energy blade a whisper of violet light. She met the first attacker's blade not with force, but with a perfectly logical parry that used his own momentum to send him crashing into another guard. Her style was pure Zale, a martial art refined over centuries, economical, precise, and utterly lethal. She was a dancer in a storm of death, every movement calculated for maximum effect. But there were too many. They were her own guards. She had trained them, and they knew her style. They pressed in, a wall of black and silver armor, forcing her back toward the dais. Then Wyatt moved, and the nature of the fight changed. He was not a dancer. He was a landslide. He met the guards not with technique, but with raw, brutal power and the close-quarters combat instincts of 100 desperate brawls on a dozen worlds. He grabbed the wrist of a guard swinging a shock baton, and bone crunched with a sickening snap. He used the guard as a shield, shoving him into the path of a comrade's blade before driving his fist into the second guard's helmet with enough force to shatter its armored facing. He fought with a fury that was utterly alien to the Jael. It wasn't the berserker rage of a beast. It was a focused, intelligent storm of violence. He saw openings they didn't know they had, exploited weaknesses in their rigid formations that their logical training had never anticipated. He was chaos personified, an unpredictable, unstoppable force of nature. He cleared a space around the human ambassador, roaring a challenge at the guards who hesitated before his sheer ferocity. His actions bought Vera the opening she needed. She broke through the containing line, her eyes locked on Lord Vorlog, who stood near the throne, his blade ready. "You were my mentor," she said, her voice shaking with a rage she no longer tried to suppress. "You taught me the value of a pure, logical mind. And you have thrown it away for a creature of impulse and emotion." Vorlog sneered, lunging forward. Their blades met in a shower of sparks. It was master versus student. He was stronger, more experienced, his every move a textbook application of Jael swordsmanship. But Vera was different now. She was no longer just a vessel of pure logic. She fought with passion, with the fury of betrayal, with the fierce, protective instinct Wyatt's sacrifice had awakened in her. She allowed an opening, a feint that was illogical, reckless, a human gambit. Vorlog, unable to resist the logical advantage, stepped into the trap. Vera's blade moved in an impossible arc, disarming him and ending with the glowing tip resting a millimeter from his throat. The throne room fell silent, save for the ragged sound of breathing. The coup was over. The aftermath was a quiet, efficient storm of arrests and interrogations. Lord Vorleg's conspiracy, built on the foundations of logic and tradition, had crumbled in the face of human intuition and fury. The separatist cell was exposed as his unwitting pawns. The alliance with the Terran Collective was no longer a matter of debate. It was a celebrated fact, cemented by the blood Wyatt had shed on the Plaza of Accord. The Empress, her wisdom and foresight now undeniable, showered the human delegation with honors. But for Vera and Wyatt, the noise of politics faded into a distant hum. The galaxy could wait. That night, she dismissed her honor guard and went to his new quarters, a spacious suite granted to him by a grateful empress. He was standing by the tall window, looking out at the glittering spires of the capital city. He had discarded the formal tunic, and the faint light from the city below traced the powerful lines of his bare torso. A fresh, sterile bandage covered the worst of the new bruises he had sustained protecting the ambassador. He heard her enter and turned. His eyes, so steady and watchful, met hers across the room. There were no more ranks between them, no commander, no bodyguard, no jail, no human. There was only Vera and Wyatt. She walked towards him, her movements slow, deliberate. She stopped just before him, her gaze tracing the brutal, beautiful map of his healing wounds. She lifted a hand, her cool fingers gently touching the bruised skin on his chest where the flechette had struck. It was the same spot she had touched in the medical bay, but now there was no armor between them, no pretense, no doubt. "The physicians are still baffled by your recovery," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "They say your cellular regeneration is illogical." "We're a stubborn species," he murmured, his hand coming up to cover hers, his touch sending a jolt of warmth through her entire body. His thumb stroked the back of her hand, a simple, gentle gesture that made her heart race. "You have shown me," she began, struggling to find the words, the logical framework for the storm of feeling inside her. "You have shown me that there are truths beyond data, strengths beyond logic." She looked up, her violet eyes shining with an emotion she would no longer deny. "You have shown me. Me." He didn't speak. He simply lowered his head, and his lips met hers. The kiss was not the clumsy, aggressive act she might have once imagined from a human. It was tentative at first, a question, full of a surprising tenderness that made her knees weak. She responded with a fierce, pent-up passion, a decade of suppressed emotion breaking free. Her hands moved from his chest, tangling in his dark hair, pulling him closer. His arms wrapped around her, lifting her effortlessly against him. The hard, warm strength of his body was an undeniable truth, a physical reality that overwhelmed all logic. She felt the cool metal of her uniform press against his heated skin. A final fleeting barrier between two worlds, two species, two souls who had found each other in an act of violence and been reborn in an act of sacrifice. In the silent, starlit room high above the Jalian capital, a new treaty was signed, one of passion and promise, sealed not with ink but with a touch, a kiss, and the quiet, certain knowledge that they were, finally and completely, home. One Jalian standard year had passed since the day the throne room ran with the blood of traitors. In the Praetorian Guard's primary training arena, the air still hummed with the snap hiss of energy blades and the thud of armored bodies hitting padded mats, but the philosophy behind the violence had changed. Commander Vera stood on the observation balcony, her arms crossed over her chest plate. Below, a class of new recruits moved through combat katas, their forms perfect, their faces masks of serene logical focus. They were exactly as she had once been. She watched one recruit, a promising but rigid young male, execute a flawless series of parries against a training drone. He moved with the brutal efficiency of a machine, his every action dictated by probability and tactical doctrine. The drone, however, had been reprogrammed. It was running a new simulation Vera herself had designed, one she called the human variable. The drone suddenly abandoned its optimal attack pattern, feinting an illogical, inefficient wide swing. The recruit, his mind unable to process the tactical flaw, moved to exploit the opening he was presented. It was a trap. The drone's other arm snapped forward in a tight, brutally fast jab, striking the recruit square in the chest and sending him stumbling backward, his practice blade skittering across the floor. A faint, almost imperceptible smile touched Vera's lips. She saw her old self in him, the arrogance of certainty, the blindness of pure, unadulterated logic. She had since learned that the universe was not a clean equation to be solved. It was a messy, chaotic, beautiful thing, full of variables that defied calculation. He forgot to feel the rhythm of the fight, a low voice murmured from beside her. She didn't turn. She didn't need to. In the past year, she had learned to recognize his presence as a distinct shift in the very air around her, a subtle warmth that was as familiar as her own heartbeat. Wyatt leaned against the railing, his dark Terran tunic a stark contrast to the sea of silver and black armor below. His right arm, the one nearly torn from his body by Vorlog's guards, rested easily on the rail. Only a faint network of silvery Jalian scar tissue across his shoulder and pectoral, visible in the tunic's V-neck, spoke of the damage he had sustained. He was no longer a bodyguard, but the official Terran military liaison to the Praetorian Guard, a post created specifically for him. His flawed intuition was now considered a strategic asset of galactic importance. "The rhythm is an illogical concept, liaison," Vera replied, a hint of playful formality in her tone. "So is gravity until you fall on your ass," he countered, his eyes crinkling at the corners. He offered her a steaming mug. The rich, dark aroma of roasted Terran coffee beans wafted from it, a scent she now associated with late nights, quiet mornings, and the comforting solidity of his presence. She took it, her fingers brushing his, the contact a familiar spark. "You are corrupting my recruits with your primitive aphorisms," she said, taking a sip. The liquid was hot, bitter, and wonderfully stimulating, a chaotic beverage for a chaotic mind. She had come to adore it. "I'm not the one who programmed the drones to pull moves from a drunken bar fight," he said, his gaze dropping to the arena floor. "That was all you, Commander." She watched the recruit get back to his feet, his face a mask of confusion. Vera activated her comm, her voice projecting calmly into the young Jael's earpiece. "Your logic was flawless, recruit, but you failed to account for desperation, for malice. You predicted the opponent's most efficient move. You did not consider his most hateful one. Analysis without empathy is blindness. Begin again." Wyatt looked at her, his expression full of a quiet pride that made her heart, in its most illogical fashion, beat faster. "Look at you," he said softly, "teaching spies how to feel." "I am teaching warriors how to win," she corrected, though there was no heat in it. "There is a difference." He simply smiled, a slow, easy expression that was more intimate than any kiss. In the year since the coup, they had built a life in the spaces between their duties. It was a life of quiet understanding, of shared glances across crowded council chambers, of hands clasped in the privacy of their quarters. He had taught her the logic of a loyal heart, and she, in turn, had taught him the peace of a quiet mind. Together, they were something more than the sum of their parts. They were the living symbol of the Alliance, and a testament to the fact that the galaxy's most profound truths were often found in the beautiful, chaotic space between two different worlds. The great hall of the Empress glittered. 1,000 floating lights drifted through the vast chamber like captive stars, their glow reflecting off the jeweled attire of Jalian nobles and the crisp, formal uniforms of the Terran Diplomatic Corps. The gala was to celebrate the first anniversary of the Alliance, a year in which the combined might of Jael strategy and Terran tenacity had pushed the scourge back on 3 fronts. The war was far from over, but for the first time in a generation, there was hope. At the center of it all, standing beside the Empress's receiving line, were Vera and Wyatt. They were a striking, almost mythical sight. Vera was in her formal, non-combat armor, the polished black plates chased with silver filigree that matched the single elegant jewel braided into her obsidian hair. Wyatt stood beside her in the dark blue full-dress uniform of a Terran officer, his broad shoulders and solid presence a perfect grounding counterpoint to her ethereal, predatory grace. They were a symbol, and they both knew it. Every eye was upon them, the Jael with a newfound curious respect, the humans with a fierce, protective pride. "I never thought I'd be a museum exhibit," Wyatt murmured, his voice a low vibration she could feel through the floor. "One must be an artifact to be in a museum, my dear," Vera replied, her voice equally low, her lips barely moving. "At the moment, you are merely a monument." He chuckled softly. "Right. I'm the guy who was too stubborn to die. They'll build statues of me, holding a bloody chunk of my own chest." "They might," she said, a flicker of a smile touching her lips. It was a very impressive chunk. The Empress, a tiny, ancient figure on her hovering throne, beckoned them forward. "Commander Vera, Liaison Wyatt," she said, her voice a soft, rustling sound that still commanded the attention of the entire hall. "A year ago, our two peoples were strangers, wary and mistrustful. Now, we are shield brothers. This is in no small part due to your courage, your sacrifice, and your ability to see beyond the confines of your own cultures." Her old, wise eyes settled on them both. "You have taught us that logic and passion are not enemies, but two blades of the same pair of shears. Together they can sever any thread." It was the highest praise Ajael could offer, a public rewriting of their core philosophy. As they bowed, Vera felt Wyatt's hand find hers behind her back, his fingers lacing through hers, a silent, powerful affirmation. Later, as they circulated, Ajael Noble, a cousin of the disgraced Vorlag, approached them. His posture was stiff, his eyes cold. "Commander," he said, ignoring Wyatt entirely, "the war goes well, but one wonders at the cost. Our traditions are being diluted by this influx of Terran emotionalism." Before Vera could deliver a logically devastating retort, Wyatt stepped slightly forward, placing himself between her and the noble. He didn't say a word. He simply met the noble's gaze with a calm, utterly neutral expression. But there was a weight to his stillness, a promise of brutal physical consequence that was universally understood. The noble's composure faltered. He gave a curt, jerky nod and retreated back into the crowd. Wyatt turned back to her. "You were going to dissect him with words," he said. "I was," Vera admitted. "Sometimes," he said, his thumb gently stroking the back of her hand, "a look is more efficient." She gazed at him, at this impossible man who had crashed into her life and rearranged her very soul. He had faced down assassins, traitors, and now the subtle venom of courtly politics, all with the same unshakable core of integrity. He was not a beast. He was not a monument. He was hers. And as the gala swirled around them, all she could think about was the quiet sanctuary of their rooms and the private, illogical truth of their love. The heavy doors to their quarters slid shut, sealing out the noise and ceremony of the gala. For a long moment, they simply stood in the silent, dimly lit room, the day's tension slowly uncoiling from them. Wyatt reached up and unfastened the high collar of his dress uniform, the stiff fabric sighing as it came loose. Vera watched the simple domestic act, an odd sense of peace settling over her. This was the truth of their lives now, not the galas or the battles, but these quiet moments of return. "I believe that Noble may require a new pair of trousers," she said, a rare note of dry humor in her voice. Wyatt stretched, the thick muscle of his back and shoulders bunching powerfully. "He's lucky that's all he needs." His eyes found hers, the playful light in them softening into something deeper, more intense. "Are you all right? I know seeing his family, it brings Vorlag back." She nodded, walking toward him. "It does, but it no longer brings confusion, only a clear sense of what was lost and what was gained." She stopped in front of him, her hands coming up to rest on the solid wall of his chest. Beneath the fine fabric of his uniform, she could feel the steady, powerful beat of his heart. What we gained. His hands settled on her waist, his large, warm palms a familiar and welcome weight against the cool metal of her armor. "Vera," he just said her name, but it was filled with a universe of meaning. "Unlace me," she whispered. It had become a ritual between them. Her armor was a complex mesh of interlocking plates and magnetic seals, designed to be removed by automated valets. But she had long since forbidden the machines from the task. There was an intimacy to it, an act of profound trust and vulnerability that she reserved for him alone. His fingers, so surprisingly deft for their size, moved to the small of her back, finding the hidden clasps. One by one, the magnetic seals disengaged with a series of soft clicks. The heavy cuirass lifted away, followed by the pauldrons and vambrasses, until she stood before him in the simple thin black undersuit. She felt his gaze on her, a palpable heat that had nothing to do with logic and everything to do with a fierce, possessive adoration that still made her breath catch. She reached for him in turn, her hands working the buttons of his uniform, pushing the heavy fabric off his shoulders until he stood as bare as she. The silvery tracery of his scars gleamed in the low light, a map of the pain he had endured for her. She leaned forward and pressed her lips to the center of the largest scar right over his heart. He inhaled sharply, his fingers tangling in her long dark hair. He tilted her head back, his mouth finding hers in a kiss that was no longer tentative or questioning, but deep and sure, a kiss of profound familiarity and ever-new discovery. It was a kiss that spoke of shared battles and quiet mornings, of arguments over tactics and laughter over spilled coffee. He lifted her into his arms, his muscles cording as he carried her toward the bedroom. The cool, recycled air of the palace felt miles away, replaced by the heated, private atmosphere they created together. He laid her on the soft bed, his body covering hers, a welcome weight of strength and warmth. His lips trailed from her mouth to her jaw, down the long, elegant column of her throat, and lower still. She arched against him, a low, involuntary sound escaping her lips. This, she thought, this illogical, chaotic, overwhelming sensation, this was the human variable, and she would spend the rest of her life joyfully failing to analyze it. Vera awoke to the soft, twin suns of Zalia filtering through the high windows of their quarters. For a moment she lay still, cataloging the sensations. The scent of Wyatt's skin, the heavy weight of his arm draped possessively over her waist, the quiet, steady rhythm of his breathing against her back. These were the data points of her new reality, and they brought a sense of peace that no tactical analysis ever could. She shifted carefully, turning in his embrace to face him. In sleep, the watchful intensity was gone from his features. He looked younger. The hard lines of his face softened. A lock of his dark hair had fallen across his forehead, and she gently brushed it back. His skin was warm, a constant, living furnace against her own, which was naturally cool to the touch. It was a contrast she had come to crave, a physical reminder of the beautiful disparity of their origins. He had brought so much chaos to her ordered life. He argued with her about the placement of furniture. He left half-empty mugs of his bitter Terran coffee on pristine data consoles. He played ancient, raucous human music that violated every Zalian principle of harmonic theory, and he had filled the sterile silence of her existence with laughter, passion, and a love so profound it defied every logical parameter she had ever known. He stirred, his eyes opening slowly. They were a warm, deep brown, and when they focused on her, they held a tenderness that still had the power to stop her heart. "Morning, Commander," he murmured, his voice thick with sleep. "Good morning, Liaison," she replied, her fingers tracing the rugged line of his jaw. He smiled, leaning in to kiss her softly. "I was dreaming," he said against her lips. Logically, it was a REM cycle neural fur. Oh, never mind, she stopped herself, a small smile playing on her own lips. "What did you dream of?" "The future," he said simply. He shifted, pulling her closer until her head was resting on his chest, right over the network of scars that had become a part of their story. "Quiet house, no alarms, maybe a couple of kids with your eyes and my stubbornness." Vera closed her eyes, listening to the steady, powerful beat of his heart beneath her ear. A future. A family. Concepts that had once been abstract, logical necessities for the continuation of a bloodline. With him, they felt different. They felt like a promise of warmth, of laughter, of a beautiful, shared chaos. She thought of the young recruits in the arena, of the Zalian Empire slowly, cautiously learning to embrace the strength found in emotion. She thought of the war and the hard-won hope forged by their two peoples. All of it, a future saved by a single illogical act of sacrifice. All of it, born from the moment she spat at his feet, and he chose to save her anyway. "That," she whispered, a feeling of pure, unanalyzable joy swelling in her chest, "sounds entirely logical to me."